Welcome back to our Thursday evening class and meditation. So, as I've said in the prior classes, I hope everyone's doing well, and it seems like a lot of parts of the country are going to start coming out of our quarantine slowly. So, I'd urge everyone to do that with caution and still take precautions. We've seen other parts of the world have resurgences and have to go back into lockdowns and things like that. So we all need to live. At the same time, I think it's good if we all show some care and not only for ourselves but for others. Is I think now more than ever we see how connected we all are through this pandemic. So we are on, I have the text up, page 27 of the PDF. So this is, this section is the causes and conditions of humankind being in samsara. And I want to talk a little bit about the title of this section first, and then we'll get into these categories that are listed. So it starts off there at the first, second, third, fourth that you can see on this page and goes through. So it starts off there, the mentality that emerges in the state of non-enlightenment, which incorrectly perceives and reproduces the world of objects, and conceiving that the reproduced world of objects is real, continues to develop deluded thoughts, is what we define as mind. This mind has 5 different names. So we have the inside joke that that Buddhism always gives us lists of things. So that's a very common way of transmitting data, transmitting knowledge within the Buddhist system, is to break things out into categories and lists. So besides that, though, I want to look at kind of the title, the cause and conditions of humankind being in samsara. And I think we generally think of samsara as a place, meaning this world in which we live. So we think of it very rigidly, I think. It's a physical location. What the text here wants us to do is think about samsara a little bit differently and think about it more in terms of mental function. So I think you can think of this as a really great self-help manual where the Awakening of Faith is asking us to think of samsara as very similar to any other mental process. So if we equate it to negative thinking or positive thinking, feeling motivated or not feeling motivated, all of those are states of mind that we're more familiar with and we will talk about often. I usually upload these to YouTube. So if you go on YouTube and you can search for all sorts of motivation to do things, motivation to cook. So it'll show a video of someone cooking something very beautifully, or motivation to do, become the next Mr. Olympia, show someone lifting some impossible amount of weight, all these different things as a motivation. So there's a lot of focus, I think, in our culture on mindset. And the Awakening of Faith, to some degree, is showing us the same thing, but it's going deeper than sort of a momentary mindset. It's going deeper on what really, how the mind functions at a deeper level. So I think if you look at samsara this way, it's something that we slip into and out of throughout the day, the course of a month or a year. This type of thinking is happening all the time. So samsara is something we can train our minds to recognize, identify, and then hopefully avoid. So that's what this section of the Awakening of Faith is trying to train us to do. So this is mind training techniques, and part of that training is recognizing. So the Buddha was from the warrior caste. So I'm going to make a military example. So if you train in the military, they're going to teach you to identify the opponent's troop movements, and if you're looking through binoculars, what formations on the horizon are suspicious. What should you be on the lookout for? The same thing would be true for police. You're walking the beat, and what things are off, what things should stick out. It may not be immediately noticeable to someone who's not trained, but those signs are there. And this is part of what the awakening of faith is helping us to do, is really see these other aspects of mind that are always happening, but we're not immediately aware of them. So if you develop that, then you can have that realization like, there I am slipping into samsaric thinking. And so at this time I should do XYZ practice. Or there I go about to click on this web link, something very salacious. And I'm going to get caught up in someone's Instagram or something. And then we can kind of become more aware of that, right? So those are probably the more obvious mental traps. So somehow I ended up on a mailing list. I bought some accessory for our YouTube channel camera, and now I'm on a mailing list of like all of these, huge sale, act now, time is running out. Constantly, it's sort of like, what is that, So you can very easily in our world be pulled to distraction. So part of this observation is very much like that, right? How does the mind function? Because we're not aware of it right away. So I think the key to this section is understanding that samsara arises from the mind's engagement with and the mind's engagement in non-enlightened activities. So it's when we're engaged in things that aren't so helpful or wholesome that we go deeper into samsara. So that's the key. Now, somebody asked me years ago, why is it that religion doesn't want you to have fun? Because they perceived that everything that the sutras or any religious text advised against was what they considered to be fun. So why can't you have fun? And I would say that's not exactly true, at least from the Buddhist perspective. What the text wants you to do, or the teaching wants you to do, is ask, is it really fun? Or have you been conditioned to think that that's entertaining and fulfilling, but actually other things are more fulfilling? So there's a lot of discussion in the sutras of taking joy in ethical practice, moral practice, simplicity, a lot of these things, which are more fulfilling and more last longer than things that we thought were fun before. So I like to point that out, because sometimes when we get into, so there's, how many of us are on the call this evening, right? There's 8 people or so, right? If I titled this sort of, Buddhism and some salacious thing, or Buddhism and mind altering substances, and I'd have 500 people. But when you talk about things that are not as immediately salacious or immediately tantalizing in the way that we're accustomed, then we don't have as much tendency to click on it or follow it. So part of this is gathering interest in other aspects of life that are more long lasting and truly fulfilling. So this section is going to start right after this first introductory paragraph. Breaks down for us the various ways that the mind operates to take us into samsara, right? So what is the mind doing? How does it function? If you leave it alone, kind of what is its natural tendency? And it's helpful here to remember that the awakening of faith has told us there is one mind and that it has two aspects, right? So there's one mind and two aspects. And this section is a finer, more granular understanding of the operation of that process, moving from the enlightened mind away from the enlightened mind. What is the process whereby that happens? So that's a lot of what is being discussed in these sections. Some of them are very simple, and a few of them are a bit more complex in terms of Buddhist philosophy. So I'm going to try not to make it too, I don't want anyone to fall asleep. So I'm going to try to make it kind of interesting and not so like philosophy class. But some of it I think is fun philosophy class. And then others are, even for a true Buddhist nerd like myself, you know, you get into the weeds of different philosophical schools between the fourth and sixth centuries in India. So we'll limit that part. So the first one there, so it says the mind has 5 different names. For some reason, oh, there we go. So this mind has 5 different names. The first is called the activating mind, for without being aware of it, it breaks the equilibrium of mind by force of ignorance. So the first one is a little cryptic. So I'm going to explain it in terms of Western philosophy. So some of you may be familiar with it, some might not. So stop me if it's too boring, or if you know this information already. So I'm going to make liken this to the allegory of the cave from Plato. So it's in Plato's Republic. So some of you may be familiar with this. So in Plato's Republic, Plato and Socrates discuss the allegory of the cave. And what Plato describes is that humanity, the example he gives is that humans, it's as if we're chained to the wall in a cave and we're taken there as young children. So we've forgotten or we've never known anything different. And behind us, there's a fire and people are passing or things are passing in front of the fire, and those things cast a shadow on the wall of the cave. And so all of us chained to the wall, the only thing we know are these shadows. So we come to label them, identify them, name them. We create stories about them. And we're convinced that what we see, that these shadows are actual reality. This is reality. And of course, Plato goes on to say, you know, some people very rarely can escape the cave. And those who escape and see reality for what it really is are philosophers. And of course, then naturally, the job of the philosopher to go back into the cave and explain true reality to people is both noble but also incredibly difficult. So this is the Greek philosophy idea of humanity's struggle and how we don't see things clearly. This is also a very good, I think, crossover analogy to what Buddhism describes as ignorance. It's not a lack of intelligence. It's more that we're so conditioned to see things a certain way, we just assume that's the way it is, and we don't question. And we take what we see as being completely real and the entire story in and of itself. So you'll hear this described in different ways. Someone will say just shadows on a wall, or you know, the allegory of the cave. Um, but I think there's a couple things that we can learn from this example. One is Plato is clear that you're not born in the cave, right? At some point when you're very young, you're taken there. And I think that's a very good analogy for the Buddhist idea that the enlightened mind is inherent in the person, but due to your experiences, it's obscured. So you don't see it right away. The other part is you can break free, but it's difficult. And it's difficult because you have to challenge all these basic assumptions. And challenging those basic assumptions is really difficult. Um, sometimes it requires, a trigger, right? The philosopher comes back and says, I've seen there's a world above with a blue sky, and you're like, no, 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 there's just these shadows, right? I don't believe you. But some people might get really interested in that idea. So it's a difficult thing to do. So this, I think, overlap is a really good um, Buddhist story. And our passage here says um, the equilibrium is broken by the force of ignorance. So the enlightened mind persists until ignorance arises. And the rest of these statements go on to describe a little bit more about how um, ignorance arises and how that affects the true nature of mind. I think this is a really important point. If you postulate, you know, human beings, sentient beings are originally enlightened, then you have to wonder, well, how did you get unenlightened, right? Where was the, to use a Christian term, like where was the fall from grace, so to speak? And I think to some degree it's the, the nature of consciousness, as will be described, has these other features, which if you're not careful, right, if you don't watch, can create a world of their own, like Plato says in the cave, right? You have this consciousness ability, you have this capability of the mind. Any of the people down there who are trapped can become a philosopher, or in the Buddhist sense, can find liberation. But if we don't question the shadows, then we just build more ignorance. So this is, if we go down a little bit further, more of what you'll see here in the text. So the second passage. The second is called the evolving mind, for it emerges contingent upon the agitated mind as the subject that perceives incorrectly. So this one's a little bit more cryptic. So what does this mean? So the second is called the evolving mind. So as the mind gets mixed up with this ignorance, right? As you're, as Plato would say, in the cave looking at the shadows, new false thinking arises, and a new mind arises as a result of this mistaken knowledge. So it's not just a matter of seeing the shadows and naming them and taking them for being real. You, as humans do, start to make up stories about them. Oh, I wonder if the tall shadow is friends with the short shadow, and what kind of life do they have, and are their conversations similar to ours? And then it gets more and more complex. These assumptions that are built up on top of the initial seed of ignorance. So the classic example that's used in Buddhism for explaining this is the nature of water. So it says the nature of water is wet, and it's normally clear. So this is its nature. But when outside forces act upon it, it accords with those forces. So when the wind blows, it develops waves. But waves are not a fundamental part of water. The true nature of water is stillness and clarity. You can see to the bottom is perfectly clear. But the outside forces, the water will move with the waves. But the lower levels underneath are still calm. So this is the classic example. And it's a really good one because, one, if you think back to ancient India, it's something that everyone would understand. And I think it's still true today, right? Everyone has encountered water. If it's stirred by an earthquake, it becomes a tsunami, right? So the nature of water can change in accord with these different outside stimuli. And this one is important because it has a lot to do with the outside stimuli. And this is the key as we go through the others, that we're trying to develop awareness of, is just the sheer mass of outside stimuli that we're exposed to and what we are not aware that is doing to us. So this is, one of the key features for meditators to develop awareness of. Um, so the evolving mind is the mind that's changing from stillness to agitated. Um, and because of the agitation, we perceive things differently. Um, if it's very windy, then a nice day at the beach becomes too dangerous. Oh, the waves are too rough. An otherwise beautiful, sunset. Oh, now there's a tsunami, right? It has a different effect on us. So the same thing goes true internally. If the mind becomes agitated, we perceive things differently, and our judgment is clouded. So if you're agitated, um, you don't make good choices usually when you're agitated. I think this is why high pressure sales was invented. People recognize that if we could get the buyer very agitated, they're more likely to buy something that they wouldn't otherwise buy. If you use fear and all these different tactics, then you can change their judgment. So, has anyone ever tried to sell you a timeshare? Has anyone had this experience? You get trapped in one of those presentations, and it becomes almost like I'll agree to anything as long as you let me out of this room. Right? How do I get out of here? And it works. It's the same. Um, Someone took me to one. It was, oh gosh, over 20 years ago, and eventually I was like, what is this? And why would anyone, do this to another person? This is horrible. And then the same tactic is used. So when you can agitate someone, the judgment changes. So think about it this way: there are philosophies, religions, ideas that are sold or presented using those same techniques. Um, my dad always jokes that yeah, I should have a TV show where you're jumping around and yelling and like the other like kind of Sunday morning TV shows that are on cable access or something. And I said that's not very Buddhist. And he goes, well, that's why people aren't. You don't have a large crowd. And I said that's okay. That is totally okay. So it's not a. I don't think a good. Um, we're trying to develop awareness, not use a timeshare technique to get people to understand the Buddhist teaching. So, but think about what it's doing. It's using threats, you're being cajoled, you're being pushed in one way or another. And anytime that's happening to you, it clouds your judgment. So this is the effect that ignorance has on the human mind. It's really clouding your judgment. I don't think we often think of it that way, but it's very common to have this experience, right? Anytime we're um, imbalanced, upset, agitated, we have this reaction. What's helpful about this, especially in a text like the Awakening of Faith, is if you turn it around, you get the antidote, right? So if you can work the equation backwards. So if the text says if you're agitated, you don't have good judgment, you can think about the example of water. If you don't add the wind, if you don't add the earthquake, then the nature of the water, the nature of mind remains clear. The nature of the mind remains calm. So the more we're aware of these external stimuli and how they affect us, we, in my thinking, we take away the power that they have over us, and we can avoid that second level of the arising of ignorance. Or we may still be in the cave with the others, but we're no longer tricked into thinking these shadows are some sort of actual reality. Okay. So the third is called the reproducing mind, for it reproduces the entire world of objects as a bright mirror reproduces all material images. When confronted with the objects of the five senses, it reproduces them at once. It arises spontaneously at all times and exists forever, reproducing the world of objects in front of the subject. So, first, keep in mind we're reading a text that's pretty ancient at this point. So, phrasing is a little odd. So, what this is talking about is um, the nature of the mind in terms of the five senses. So, touch, hearing, scent, taste, all of your basic five senses. So there's a consciousness associated with those. And the nature of that aspect of consciousness or that aspect of mind that's associated with your senses operates like a mirror. So if you pick up something like prayer beads, your mind cannot, these are smooth, the wood is hard, they're a little bit cold right now. It gives you all that information right away. So you can't not get that sensory input unless the sense is broken. Um, the same with sandpaper. It's immediately coarse. Um, all of those things are immediately transmitted to the mind. You can't look at something without having the data transmitted to the mind. So it operates like a mirror, and that part is important to understand, because the senses, whenever they come into contact with something, they report that information to the mind. The mind then reflects the sensory input into multiple layers. So you have cold, hard, heavy prayer beads, right? All of that stuff comes together right away. The only time you don't have that is sort of you don't know what it is you're looking at, and you're trying to get all the sensory data, and all of it is sort of overwhelming you, right? So you're overwhelmed by the sensory data. You're trying to figure out what's going on, right, or what's happening. So at any rate, this is the right, this constant sensory input. The it's sometimes defined as perpetual consciousness, that when we don't think we're thinking about anything, we may be asleep, we may think we're very calm. In fact, the minds and the senses are still bringing in all that data, right? We're not really escaping from all the sensory data. It's still coming, right? We're still being overwhelmed. So it's sometimes described as manifesting cognition. Um, Everything from the external world is being represented in our consciousness, right? We could be on a nice, stroll through the park. Still, everything in the world is being represented through the consciousness. So there's just a lot of sensory input and overload. So part of what the awakening of faith is warning us about is just that nature of the mind, the nature of the mind that is constantly collecting and cataloging information that's, I guess, in a Western sense, we may say we're not even consciously aware of. It's constantly happening, though. That's important because it connects with the alaya consciousness, our storehouse consciousness. So all of the sensory input's happening, and the mind is collecting it, and it's being stored away. And sometimes, without our being ready, it may trigger something. So I think this shows up a lot in Western psychology. We have some triggering event. We may not even be aware of it, or you'll hear sometimes people say, I ran into someone at the store, and that triggered a memory for me later. I wasn't even aware of it at the time. So that's due to this ability of the mind to just constantly bring in this information. So I think you'll see it sometimes in traumatic events. Um, you're not consciously aware of what happened at the moment. So this is a protective quality the mind has. They can get you through the immediate trauma, and then later those images or memories. For many people, if it's very traumatic, can be a you know, full sensory experience happens later, right? That information comes up. So that's due to this quality of the mind that is constantly like a mirror, perfectly reflecting everything that comes in contact with. Um, Philosophically, this is important because this eighth level of consciousness, the alaya consciousness, is where all of your past life memories are. It's a full record of everything that you've experienced, um, both helpful and unhelpful. So there may be karmic seeds that are planted there, that can be of help for you. You may say, this is the right, this teaching or this particular spiritual place resonates with me for some reason. So that those those feelings are in the alive consciousness. Similarly, you may have a very strong negative reaction, so that can be something to investigate. Why is that? What is deeply embedded in the consciousness that reacts negatively towards something? So those things are always being brought in. So um, this is part of these five. The way it's presented here in the Awakening of Faith is actually a description of the eight levels of consciousness in Buddhist thinking. So this is another way of presenting it. Is an earlier way. Again, at the time the text was written, this is one of the ways it was presented. I think the key here, though, is its spontaneous operation. So without our conscious awareness, the world's being presented to us all the time. When we're in meditation, when we're sleeping, the body is taking in all of this data and it's reflected on the mind. So in fact, we have a tremendous capacity, but on the other hand, we can also be overwhelmed. So it's this constant sensory input. It's like streaming video and stereo all the time into your body, and at the same time also scent and taste and just everything constantly. So some of that is of our choosing. We choose to listen to the music or watch a TV show, so we've chosen for that particular sensory input. Sometimes it's not of our choosing. If somebody passes us in the road with their stereo blaring, and so we're exposed to their music and we take that in. There might be somebody outside yelling and making noise, and so we take that in also. So the mind is reflecting like a mirror all of these sensory inputs all the time. So in fact, I think we have a very immense potential for just sensory input that we're not aware of. But it's no wonder, I think, especially as society, gets faster and there's more and more information that we're responsible for looking at, we can get overwhelmed. So I think you see more people, suffering burnout or needing to take a break and get away from it all. I don't know. This just occurs to me. I don't know that woodcutters of old were like, it's just too many trees. I've got to get away from it all. Or letter carriers in the Pony Express. Well, it's just too many mailboxes. I've got to get away from it all. I think that's more a product of industrialization, that our capacity is being overwhelmed. So at any rate, so we'll keep going. So the fourth one, so that was the third. So the fourth is called the analytical mind, for it differentiates what is defined and what is what is defiled and what is undefiled. This analytical mind is deeply connected to the Awakening of Faith's idea of one mind with two aspects. So the whole time we're being bombarded with sensory input, the entire time that our consciousness, right, that's like water, pure, right, is being stirred up by the wind of all the things around us. The mind still has this other potential, right, this enlightened mind potential also, and it's functioning right along with the diluted mind. So using the water analogy, water's nature is wet, its nature is clear, it's clarity. When you mix water with a lot of mud and algae and pollution, it loses this essential nature, or at least this essential nature is obscured. And when it's so obscured, we no longer refer to it as water. We refer to it as swamp or cesspool or mud. And if you're confronted with cesspool, swamp, mud, and someone says, "Oh, look at the water," you're going to say, "Where?" Oh, you'd recoil. I don't see any water. um, and it attracts new things, right? So the creatures that live in the cesspool are not the creatures that live in the very clear, pristine water. Um, Being in Oregon, we have the pleasure sometimes of hiking through the mountains in a normal year, and coming upon streams, and especially in the national forest, there's oftentimes little signs that say protected habitat, or trout or salmon spawning. And I always find it very interesting because that water is incredibly clear and unlike a lot of other bodies of water. Um, but when the water is not that clear, then those animals in nature aren't living there. The key, though, no matter how polluted, no matter how filled with mud or muck, the water is still water. It hasn't lost its essential nature of being wet, but it's very, very obscured. So this fourth section is saying that the mind itself can still differentiate, but our deluded mind, right, the mind that's like those poor souls in Plato's example in the cave, cannot distinguish between it. They still only see the shadows. So that's the kind of the key feature of the fourth mind. So we go on down. The fifth is called the continuing mind, for it is united with deluded thoughts and continues uninterrupted. It retains the entire karma, good and bad, accumulated in the immeasurable lives of the past, and does not permit any loss. It is also capable of bringing the results of the pain, pleasure, etc., of the present and the future to maturity. In, in doing so, it makes no mistakes. It can cause one to recollect suddenly the things of the present and the past, and to have sudden and unexpected fantasies of the things to come. Interesting. So here's the alaya consciousness, this sometimes referred to the storehouse consciousness. So this is your deep internal catalog. There's a lot of within Indian philosophy, Vedic philosophy in general, sometimes other words for this, other philosophies and newer religious philosophies and ideas have a similar idea. Um, for the individual, this is your full record of all of your past experiences, sensory input, ideas, dreams, thoughts, actions, both this lifetime and prior lifetimes. And this alaya consciousness is, if you read about it from a philosophical standpoint, it answers a question that came up in Buddhist philosophy. So in the Abhidharma, the idea is that everything that we're experiencing is the result of ongoing stimuli. So deluded thoughts are arising or coming about because of stimuli coming in, the thoughts come in, ignorance, that whole process is happening. It it left some unanswered questions. So if you don't have this continual stimuli, and your cognitive awareness isn't being created in this manner, what happens then? So the idea was saying that there had to be some function or ability of the mind or the consciousness to catalog this information, and hold it so that there was a record, so to speak. So if all the aspects of mind were just momentary, then early students of Buddhism said, well, wouldn't that apply also to practice? So if we stop practicing, would it matter? Does it help? Should we continue to practice? Um, what? How do we extinguish past karma if there's no sort of repository? It's often written about in terms of the Alaya consciousness was sort of invented to solve a philosophical problem, I think that scholarly view overlooks the fact that those great Buddhist philosophers were also practitioners. Um, and I think it doesn't take too much for any practitioner, anyone who's spiritually sensitive, to recognize we often have a deeper sense of things, in the West called deja vu, or you might have a strong feeling. And um, the Alaya consciousness is, where those things reside. It has to be worked through, like your attic or garage that's filled with things that you keep meaning to take to Goodwill or donate or get rid of. So there might be a lot of things there that are obstacles, but there could be a lot of things there that are also helpful. Um, there, as past life memories, there's things that you may need to work on, but they have to be um, sorted through in time, right, in due time. So all of your samsaric experience is cataloged and contained in the Alaya consciousness. It's the the obstacle with the Alaya consciousness is, and this happens for many people, but well, most people, but also for even meditators, and it shows up in stories where you mistake the Alaya consciousness, this catalog, for a self. Like, oh, okay, um, all of these memories and experiences and everything are a permanent existing self. Um, and that's very easy to kind of make that philosophical mistake. So there's a lot of writing that talks about how the Alaya consciousness isn't the self. But what's unusual is in the awakening of faith, the Alaya consciousness is identified with the enlightened mind. So it says that is the repository of the enlightened mind. So an important part here is to understand that that's not an independent, existing, permanent self the way we think it is. It's that it's also a quality of the mind. So that is the repository for your past life memories, past practice, um, and past spiritual insights that sometimes come to the fore in this lifetime or future lifetimes. It can also be the source of insight into obstacles that you have. So those karmic seeds are planted, so to speak, in the Alaya consciousness. I think, a lot of times it's talked about, again, in too much of a dry manner, and almost as if it was invented from whole cloth by later Buddhist philosophers. I don't think that takes into consideration even the earliest suttas where the Buddha is meditating under the Bodhi tree, and in the last watch before enlightenment, he recalled all of his past lives. So that recalling had to be recalled from some place. I think what later Indian Buddhist philosophers did was give it a name and flesh it out a bit for students, so that we have a better idea of, as we're cataloging and kind of go through and create a map of consciousness, what that looks like. So it becomes easier for us as sentient beings in samsara, to create a new label for illusion so that we better understand the illusion. Right? So we know and can better communicate about it. So that's the section that's being talked about here. So there's a lot that can be said about Alaya consciousness. I'm not going to get too deep into the all the philosophical debates, especially as this was understood at the time of writing, and then later on in China, and then there were later translators that spent a lot of time um, clarifying this point, because in the translation to Chinese it caused additional confusion. So I won't go too much into that, but um, this is where the alive consciousness, that storehouse, is our kind of repository. So the triple world, therefore, is unreal and is of mind only. Apart from it, there are no objects of the five senses and of the mind. What does this mean? Since all things are, without exception, developed from the mind and produced under the condition of deluded thoughts, all differentiations are none other than the differentiations of one's mind itself. Yet the mind cannot perceive the mind itself. The mind has no marks of its own that can be ascertained as to substantiality, substantial entity as such. It should be understood that the conceptions of the entire world of objects can be held only on the basis of a person's deluded mind of ignorance. All things, therefore, are just like the images in a mirror that are devoid of any objectivity uh, that one can get hold of. They are of the mind only and are unreal. When the deluded mind comes into being, then various conceptions come to be. And when the deluded mind ceases to be, then various conceptions cease to be. That last few sentences there. So all things, therefore, are just like images in a mirror that are devoid of any objectivity that one can get hold of. They are the objects, they are the mind only and are unreal. That's your takeaway, right, from this section. The mind itself functions to reflect the world around us, but um, our mental perceptions associated with the mind are something different. Um, the last sentence there says, when the deluded mind comes into being, then various conceptions, dharmas. So that's lowercase d dharmas. What um, what Asvagosha is trying to do as part of this is settle debates amongst the different philosophical outlooks within Buddhist schools at the time in India. And one of those was that one idea was that you could, almost like the periodic table of elements, you could distill everything down to its fundamental component, including aspects of the mind or aspects of experience. So they spent a lot of time. This was a tendency in Indian philosophical thinking of breaking things down into the smallest component. So we do this in science. It's not necessarily totally helpful in Buddhist practice, but that was the approach of the earliest Buddhist philosophers. So when you see this um, sentence, something along the lines, when the deluded mind comes into being, then various conceptions, dharmas, come to be. Um, these are ideas about the nature of things. And one school of thought said, if you can categorize them all or list them out completely, then you have sort of the final basis for things. And the other schools of thought at the time said, that's a kind of a waste of time. That's not the direction you're going in. So you will find texts like the 75 Dharmas, which was philosophically an idea in second century Buddhist philosophy that said this is everything in the universe could be distilled down into these attributes. And what Asvagosha is doing in The Awakening of Faith is saying, in fact, however many you want to count, they are nothing but projections of the unenlightened mind. And understanding how the mind functions is more important than trying to categorize every single thing you might think or every type of feeling you might have, as much as we try to do that as human beings. So I'm gonna stop there because that's actually a lot of philosophy in one evening. And I'll just, before we go any farther, is there any questions about the text, that section of the text? My explanation was so good, there's no questions. That's not possible. Okay. Everyone's being too nice. We're going to do some meditation this evening. So I tried to leave some time for that. I think I actually timed it correctly this time, so we actually have a little bit of time for it. I wanted to do a little bit longer this evening because this part of the text tells us a lot about the nature and functioning of the mind. And at least in my opinion, that mirror-like awareness that the mind has, like I said, we have a lot of sensory input. And especially right now, we're probably getting a lot of news input. In the beginning of this crisis, I heard from a lot of people who had anxiety and concerns, and were just, thrown off by the change in the world. And now, as we start to reopen in certain areas, there's new anxieties and concerns and fears that arise, thinking, well, what comes next? Or what will life be like when things reopen? And what will it do to the economy and my job and those kind of things? So we have just a tremendous amount of, this kind of sensory input. And I think much like, Plato's shadows on the wall, we start to grasp for new answers and new ideas, and we may have a tendency to run off in a new direction with our thinking and our concerns. I've heard from a lot of people that, in fact, I just had a phone call right before we started the Zoom call, and someone was telling me about their dream, and I've heard that from more people, that they've had more vivid dreams in this time, and very curious symbolism that shows up. A friend dropped by earlier. He had proper social distancing, but just waved from his car, and a very similar kind of thing. His wife was sleeping more and having more anxiety. So I think there's just a lot of this kind of thing happening. So it's a good opportunity to reflect on, because it's so different, all of that sensory input, and then how much that stirs the waters of our mind, and how turbid and unclear the mind becomes as a result. So we can hopefully do a little bit meditation this evening. So if you want to find a position that's comfortable for you, I have a meditation cushion here. Apologize, the angle of the webcam is kind of narrow, so can't show you everything. But you want to sit with the body straight, but not tense. So maybe, as if you're in class and you're listening, to the teacher back in grade school, and but not military attention, right? So you're not holding tension in the body. And we're going to start this evening with a few reflections on the Dharma, and those reflections are about the nature of the teaching. So I think it's important sometimes to return to some of these basic um, ideas within within the Dharma, just to remind ourselves why we study it and then why we're practicing. So the first reflection is that the Dharma is good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end. And that statement comes from some of the earliest suttas or the sayings of the Buddha. And they refer to the components, the three components of ethics, contemplation, and discriminating insight. So, in this way, this makes the Dharma a pure practice. So, what do we mean by a pure practice? To say that Dharma is a pure practice or is good, it's good because it teaches, its teaching is not in error. So, if you look at what the Buddha's teaching includes, it's not leading you down a wrong path or a way that's going to create more problems for you. It's the ethical practice supports our life relationship with others. So it's not ethics for the sake of ethics or because someone said so. It's a way of teaching so that we can live more harmoniously with others. So when we say the Dharma is good in the beginning because of its ethics, when we start our meditation, we should reflect that our meditation practice, we hope that our meditation practice benefits not only ourselves, but also others and leads us towards more happiness. That's really what we want out of the practice. Then the Dharma, the teaching is good in the middle because the Dharma teaches freedom from desires that control our thinking. So may we practice with an open heart and an open mind of gentleness and honesty. So this is how we should approach our practice. And the Dharma is good in the end because it gives rise to liberation, having given us insight into the Buddha's teaching of suffering or anxiety. So we should think our fruits of our teaching, the merit of this practice, can free myself and others from their suffering. Okay. So with those ideas in mind, the Dharma being good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end, take our meditation posture. I have behind me an image of Kobodaishi. If you have an image of the Buddha, you can use that. So you can have your eyes open and gaze at the image, or if you want, you can have your eyes closed. We'll start taking a nice deep breath in through the nose, and then exhaling out through the mouth, just feeling the body relax. Taking a nice deep breath in through the nose, and in out through the mouth, releasing any tension in your shoulders and back. And one more deep cleansing breath, breathing in deeply in through the nose and out through the mouth, and relaxing the muscles around the eyes and mouth and your face. And thereafter, you'll be breathing in and out through your nose. You want to make sure the mouth is closed, but you don't clench your jaw. You let the tongue rest at the top of the mouth. We'll start with the sound of the bell. So please follow the sound with your mind from the loudest point till you can no longer hear the sound. And then bring your awareness and attention back to your breathing. Again, just keeping in mind those three aspects of the Dharma. Doing our meditation practice the benefit of ourselves and others, practicing with an open heart, open mind of gentleness and honesty, holding the intention that the merit of the practice frees ourselves and all beings from suffering.